So welcome everyone to, I think this is our fourth class on this course of getting to know your mind. So I will catch everyone up since we did have a little bit of a break between our last class and this one. When we start, let's go ahead and begin with prayers though. Let's see. There we go. Just have to pull up the right file. Okay. So we're going to do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. We'll recite this 3 times. And as we do this, we can think about the Buddha with some admiration of his amazing qualities, but thinking that we can be like this as well. That's what the Buddha teaches, is that we all have Buddha nature, the potential to develop our minds to that degree. So let's recite this together 3 times with those thoughts in mind. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, a completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Let's do the short mandala offering tonight, if I can get that up on the screen. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then our refuge and bodhicitta prayer, which we will recite the first time in English and then twice more in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits I create through listening to the Dharma. May I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye dupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. All right, thank you. Let's do a little meditation. Just a few minutes of watching the breath to focus our minds. And then after we do that, I'll lead you in just a very short reflection to set our motivation for being here tonight. We can just find a comfortable posture for meditation where the back is somewhat straight. You can close the eyes if you wish. It's good to maybe close them just partly so there's a little bit of light coming in. Then just relax into this posture as best as you can and begin to attend to the breath. So again, there are many ways to work with the breath. If you have one that you already use, then you're welcome to do that for the next few minutes. If you need a suggestion, again, it's good to maybe tune into that sensation at the tip of the nose where we feel the air coming in and out as we inhale, as we exhale. Whatever way you're working with the breath, try to keep your awareness with the breath. And whenever you see that the mind has wandered, then gently bring the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in this short reflection. So now to set our motivation for tonight's class, let's recall that most fundamental premise that all of the Buddhist teachings are built upon. The fact that we ourselves and all sentient beings simply want to find happiness and want to avoid all suffering, all dissatisfaction. This is what drives us every day of our lives. But the Buddha says that we've been going about attaining those results in the wrong way. We create the causes of suffering by not knowing the nature of our own minds. And when we try to achieve happiness, we don't really get the result that we seek. Because there too, we haven't created the causes within ourselves. In Buddhism, everything boils down to our minds. Our minds are the source of our happiness, and our minds are the source of our suffering. So, as we embark on another evening together looking at this topic of getting to know our minds, working with Buddhist psychology, we can do it with that beginning motivation, just simply to be able to find more happiness, to be free of more suffering, in this very life. And that's perfectly fine to start at that point. But then to recognize that the Buddha ideally wants us to achieve a more lasting peace and happiness, to be free from suffering and dissatisfaction altogether, once and for all. So here we set a more far reaching motivation, thinking that we're here to investigate the nature of our own minds, understand Buddhist psychology, not just as a means of attaining happiness in this life or future lives, but as a means of attaining liberation. And even beyond that, the state of perfect Buddhahood, enlightenment, to perfect our own minds just like the Buddha. So we then can help others to do that task as well. So try to make your motivation as vast as possible, thinking about the most far reaching result, complete Buddhahood that you yourself can achieve, and wanting that result as well for all sentient beings without exception, for every being to attain their full potential of complete enlightenment. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So again, in the previous classes, I'm primarily working with a book that is out there on the materials page for this course, short book of some writings from one of the monks in our tradition, Venerable Tupten Gyatso. And it's his approach to Buddhist psychology. And remember, in the traditional teachings, there's an entire course that we do run here sometimes in what's called the FPMT basic program, where they go through in very great detail all the various types of consciousnesses and mind and all of these mental factors. And I've been trying to go through them in a very brief way so that we kind of get the essence of them. And moreover, the emphasis is on practice, how we actually bring an awareness of these mental factors into our own minds and into our own lives. So we actually see some improvement in the quality of our lives and all of that from our being able to work with these teachings. So again, we are in this section, we went through there are 51 mental factors. Let me put that list on the page. This also is out there as one of the handouts that I put together for this course that you can find out there. The 51 mental factors are 51 factors within our minds, different aspects of our mind that the Buddha emphasized in his teachings on psychology. And they all have relevance in terms of our spiritual practice. We went through the first two groups initially, just so we understand these factors that are always present, and I will refer to them on occasion. I'm not going to go through them all again tonight. Then we have the 5 focusing mental factors. When we are involved with a particular object and knowing an object, these play a role. We know some of these from our Buddhist practice: mindfulness, concentration, knowledge, or wisdom. And these are all factors that are active a good part of the time. But those first 5 are there all the time in every moment of our mind. We're skipping over the 11 virtuous factors in a sense. I am going to be referring to a few of them as we go through the afflictions. But I really feel like the main emphasis for this course should be to look at what we call, again, these root afflictions. Afflictions are those factors that disturb our minds. They're not healthy. And of course, another way of looking at them, there are different names for these. Sometimes they call them delusions. Delusions because they're not seeing things correctly. They are not looking at reality. They are distorting reality. So we began that process last time in our final class of last year, looking at the first of those, attachment or desire, attraction. We're going to also touch on, as we go through these root afflictions, the 20 close afflictions, which are those that derive from the main afflictions that we're going to be talking about. Recall that although we have 6 on the list, the first 3 are often referred to as the 3 poisons. These are the 3 main ones that the Buddha emphasized that are really at the heart of all of our problems. And so this is a very important part. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on attachment, which I started last time. I'll finish off tonight. Anger or aversion we'll work with for at least a session or 2. And then ignorance, probably about the same. And then we'll go into some of the others to make sure that we at least touch on those and understand them and the relationship to these root poisons or main poisons. So attachment, let's go back to those 5 that I mentioned at the beginning when I was doing the list that are there all the time. Remember that what's happening with our minds in every moment of mind is we have what we call a feeling arising. And by feeling, we don't mean the whole range of emotions, right? We talked about that. We're simply talking about three different feeling tones. At any moment in time, you are experiencing something pleasant, something unpleasant, or something that is neutral. You can have different shades of that. Obviously, we have things that are quite unpleasant and painful, like going to the dentist and being drilled on or something. So we have other things that are, again, different degrees of pleasure. But every moment, we will have something registering as a feeling. And of course, we discriminate those feelings as things that we want to have if they're pleasant, to avoid if they are unpleasant. And with neutral feelings, we just kind of space out. We don't really have any particular strong reaction to those. But this is what's going on in every moment of our mind. And of course, these three poisons are our distorted reactions to that process. So, what we've talked about so far is this mind of attachment that is looking at pleasurable experiences and grasping at them, believing them to be greater than what they are, exaggerating the pleasant qualities of those objects, and wanting not to be separated from them, to kind of pull them into our lives and continue to have them. We can have attachment towards people, towards sense objects. We can have attachment to ideas, thoughts, a lot of different things where we have, as objects of our attachment. Anything that brings us pleasure is potentially an object of attachment, depending upon how much we grasp at it, how much we get kind of stuck on it, involved in it. So we were kind of introducing this whole idea of attachment and beginning to talk about the factors that give rise to it, but we didn't get into that so much. We talked about the main one, which is this distorted way of thinking, what we often call inappropriate mental attention, which is just it's our goofy thinking, our way of thinking that is not in line with reality. With objects of attachment, as I said, they're already bringing us a pleasant feeling, but we overlay on top of them a depth of pleasance that is not there. We make them into an even more pleasant object than what we are experiencing. Now we get into this deeper truth that we're going to be working with when we get to the third root poison of ignorance. But we believe that even that pleasantness is inherent within that object. Like, think about the type of music that you enjoy the most. Whatever that type of music is, and maybe some of you don't like music at all, then you can think about movies or think about TV shows or whatever. Some of you may like British mysteries or whatever. But the idea is that you want to think about what it is that you find attractive, that you find as a pleasant thing to enjoy. Again, in the category of music, there are many different things, right? And say that you like, rock music. You really like, bands from the 60s and what have you, and 70s, all this, rock music that many of us grew up with. Well, then when you hear that music, it's inducing a pleasant feeling in your own mind. And you think that that music is inherently pleasant, that everyone who hears it would hear it in the same way. But we know that that's not true, right? We invite people over and you put on your music and they're going like, oh, you're listening to that tired old music again? Why don't you put on something modern? Why don't you put on something else? And they have a different taste for music. What they see as music that brings pleasant sensations for them is very different from what we experience. Some of us have shared musical tastes or TV tastes or whatever the case might be, but we often have very different tastes. Well, just right there, that alone proves that whatever we are holding on to in regard to that object, being this object of pleasure for us, is only our experience. Maybe again, we share it with some other people, but it's not inherent in the object. I mean, think about the music that you detest. That if you hear somebody coming down the street blaring it out of their car in the summer when all the windows are rolled down and what have you, you go, oh my God, how can they listen to that garbage? I mean, this is what my mother used to say about the music I listen to, right? So now I can say it about the music that young people listen to or what have you. But so again, we can see for ourselves that these things are not inherent in the objects. We have a particular experience that is ripening for us, that's bringing us a pleasant experience. And then we overlay on top of that pleasant experience even more pleasure than what is actually there. We make it into something that is so outrageous and so wonderful. And as I mentioned last time when we met, when we do this with people, this is particularly dangerous, right? When we first fall in love, or anytime we have that desire to be in a close relationship with somebody, we overlay on top of that person qualities that are way beyond what they possess. We kind of like their voice, like their looks, like this about them, that about them, and we put them up on a pedestal. Again, the only way for them to go is down from that, because as we start to see who that person really is and what they're like and how their breath smells and whatever, then we begin to lower that. And then eventually we get to a place where all the pleasant qualities have been completely erased and we're only seeing the negative qualities. That's where we're going to go to next in terms of these three poisons, is the aversion or anger energy that arises when we experience things that are unpleasant and we exaggerate that unpleasantness. This is what our minds are doing all the time. This is one of the main factors that is causing us to suffer, is that we are not seeing things accurately. We are exaggerating the qualities. We are making things bigger than what they actually are. And we believe, of course, at the deepest level, that those things that we experience in them are inherent within the object. Even the identity of it is inherent within the object. But certainly the qualities that we are experiencing, we believe are there. How could anybody not like our music? How could anybody not like what we like in terms of a movie or a TV show? I mean, this happens all the time, though, right? You go to the movies and you see like this amazing movie that you really enjoyed, and then you talk to a friend and they said, "Oh, I saw it. Yeah, it really didn't do much for me," right? So is it a good movie or isn't it a good movie? Well, what do we have that phrase in English, right? Of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's very much the Buddhist view. What we see that we find beautiful or attractive is our projection. It has nothing to do with reality, really. I mean, we can say there are pleasant qualities within that object, but those are what we are picking up on, what we are experiencing on the basis of the karmic imprints we've created that cause those things to appear delicious, delightful, beautiful for us. So I want to take a look before we go. I don't want to spend too much time reviewing things. Take a look at the next part of the text. I do want to mention that in this part of the text, I think I mentioned this last time, but I reiterate it, is that I did find that Venerable Gyatso didn't have quite the same list that I had. These are these causes and conditions. This is on page 100 of your text. Um, there are traditionally 6 different causes and conditions that bring about the arisal of these different afflictions. And we're going to focus in on these in regard to at least attachment and anger, and we can certainly understand them in regard to other afflictions. But it is important to understand everything that is involved and why we have these minds arising. Because the mind of attachment, when the Buddha initially taught his very first discourse, he said that the reason why we're in this state of dissatisfaction, the primary reason, is because of our craving, our desire, our grasping. And that's the most operative way that we are getting caught up in our external world and thinking it's the source of all of our happiness, putting all the onus on that. So we need to understand the various factors that are involved. And so I'm just pointing out here on this a little in this text. Item number 1 there is the first one that we are going to talk about. That's that the seed of attachment is in the mind, because we are born with the tendency to become attached to pleasure and its objects. This, of course, is something that the Buddha says, is we have minds that have continuity with no beginning, and our minds go forward with no end. So essentially, we have this continuity of consciousness so that what we're dealing with in any particular life is everything that's preceded that life, in a sense, because all of that is bringing forth various seeds and imprints and karmic stuff that we have to experience. And of course, because we've had these distortions in our mind since beginningless time, we've created the seeds for every one of these afflictions to continue to arise. And every time that we have them in our mind currently, we plant another seed for it to arise again in the future. This is one of the ways that karma works in terms of our minds, karma being that fundamental law of cause and effect that the Buddha taught. Everything we do is an imprint on our minds that brings forth various results. And one of the results is that you create a seed to have that experience again. So every time you buy into the mind of anger or attachment or what have you, you are creating another seed for that delusion, that affliction to arise again. I mean, how heinous, how horrible. We just keep creating our own suffering. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, he used to say that being in this state of being under the control of these factors, especially these seeds of the afflictions and so on, is like being in prison. And while we are in prison, we keep creating the causes to extend our stay in prison. And that's really what we're doing with this first factor. We just keep planting more and more seeds of our future suffering, our future distorted and diluted states of mind. So this is one of the first ones. It's there for all of these. The reason why we have jealousy, the reason why we have pride, the reason why we have any of these afflictions is because you have the seed for them. It's been planted in your minds, zillions of times. And every time that you do it, you plant another seed, and you're going to keep ripening those seeds until you do the deeper work to get rid of all the seeds. And that's, of course, what we're going to talk about later when we get to that third root poison and how we counteract that. The ignorance that is driving the whole show is one of the forms of ignorance that we're going to get into. That's what needs to be removed to disable all of these seeds. If you don't ever do that work, you're going to continue to have those things arise lifetime after lifetime. You can make them less in your life, absolutely. That's the whole purpose of doing this kind of work, is at least to start controlling our minds a bit so we're not totally overrun by our attachment and anger and so on. But to get rid of them once and for all, you do have to do that deeper work. Okay, so let's go on then to the second one. And the second one is the same as well, what Venerable Gyatso has in his text, and that's the object of attachment. And he's using the example of another person because he's talking about the attachment we have to people, which, as I mentioned last time and even earlier tonight, that's one of the big ways that we get quite distorted with regard to our relationships with others, particularly intimate relationships. He says, remember, this is not the person, him or herself. It's the idealized person we have created in our mind, the indispensable companion, the ideal father or mother for my children, the unfailing source of happiness, my special perfect partner. Well, he is kind of overlaying to some degree some of those thoughts that I've already talked about tonight and last time, which are our mistaken conceptualizations, our inappropriate mental attention. But any time that we have a particular object of attachment that comes into our field of experience, either physically there, such as when you have the person in your presence, if it's a person we're attached to, or you have a photo of them on your phone and you look at them while you're traveling and you go, oh, there's my beloved, there's my loved one. Anytime that we have it, that we bring it into our mind through being external to us or internal to us, we have the potential for the afflictions to arise. Objects are an important part of the equation, but we put all the onus on the objects. And having an understanding of the role that objects play is important, because sometimes our first line of defense when we have problem objects for us, when we have things of attachment that we want to make sure that we're not indulging in or what have you. Here we are in the beginning of a new year, right? Maybe some of you have had New Year's resolutions around losing weight or doing certain things, and you're thinking, oh, I can't have those things around my house right now because I know that my attachment to them is so strong that I'll just start shoving them in my mouth. So again, this is a first line of defense often, right? To say, okay, I'm not going to have the object in my presence. That way I won't have attachment arise. You can do that for a while. That's not a permanent solution, though, because how can you possibly divorce yourself from all objects of attachment? Certain objects are going to come into our sphere of experience and they're going to draw us in. They're going to be that object for us. And of course, then we have the third factor, which I already mentioned, which again, he does include in his list as well, which are those incorrect ways of thinking and looking at it. So that essentially what we have is when you have the seed of the affliction, such as attachment in your mind, which again, most of us, I think all of us have, maybe some of you are further along the path than I am, but those seeds of afflictions of attachment are there waiting to arise. I come into contact with an object, that's the second factor. And then I have an inappropriate way of looking at it and thinking about it. When all three of those come together, it's guaranteed that I'm going to have that affliction arise. I'm going to have attachment towards that object. So once more, sometimes our first line of defense is to say, well, I'm not going to have the object in my life. If I divorce myself from the object, be it the person or the delicious food or the music that I enjoy or whatever, I'm going to have a distance between myself and that, and therefore it won't arise. Of course, the mind will tend to find other objects of attachment, or as I said, other things will come into our experience. But it's definite that if we have those three, that the very next moment will undoubtedly be a moment of attachment, in this case, when we're dealing with pleasant objects. So let me just show you where Venerable Gyatso goes into that last part. That's item number 6 there of the 6 factors. Inappropriate thinking exaggerates our partner or the food or whatever it is that we're attached to, we exaggerate the good qualities, ignore the bad ones, and obsessively dwell upon that object again and again to take us out on a dangerous limb of unreality. So we are essentially going after objects like this every time that these three factors arise. Okay. So you do have additional factors that play a role, though, and this is where there's some discrepancy between the way I was taught this and the way that he presents it, and it's not huge, but I'm going to go ahead and present the way that I've done it, but you can certainly read what Venerable Gyatso, the way that I learned it, but the way that Venerable Gyatso presents it is perfectly fine. He talks about the next one being proximity, but essentially, the next one that we have, well, let me share the little slide here that I have from Geshe Sopa, which says essentially the same thing that I just said, but sometimes good to hear it in other people's words. In general, he says, we say that an affliction arises, such as attachment, when it has not been eliminated from the root. In other words, the seeds for it are still there. 2, B, the object is nearby. It's in our proximity. And C, you perceive that object erroneously. This already gives us, again, some clues as to how to work with it. That distance between ourselves and the object is one way, but the main way is to change how we're thinking about objects. This is why we want to get to know our minds, is because we want to understand how we are thinking about things in our world that we experience. And are we really accurate in the way that we're thinking about them? So those are the three that are really important. He says this means that, to begin with, the affliction of attachment in this case is abiding in your continuum as a subtle propensity, a seed. Then an attractive object acting as a suitable condition comes into proximity. Finally, although that object is impure and has a nature of causing suffering because it doesn't have any real lasting ability to sustain that happiness that we experience, you view it as pure and a cause of pleasure. Again, we don't see how we are actually overlaying all kinds of qualities on things that aren't really in line with how they exist. The other three that I'm going to talk about very briefly are number 4 there, habituation. Again, this is a different order than what you might see in other texts. This is how I'm emphasizing those first 3. Habituation means that why do we have attachment for particular things? Because we've gotten very habituated to doing that. And we go after that object again and again and again. Our favorite food, our favorite music, our favorite author, our favorite this, our favorite that. We habituate ourselves to particular levels of attachment in this case. We do this with all of the delusions to some degree. Not all of them are habituated, though. I mean, we might have some that only arise occasionally. Maybe some of you are incredibly patient people and you don't have much anger in your minds, and I am prostrate at your feet. So, but nonetheless, you do have it arising, but it's not because you're habituated towards it. You haven't really developed that pattern, at least in this life, and we've been quite patient in this life. We can change, again, our habituation. We become more habituated to the correct way of looking at things, to having what we call non-attachment arise in our minds rather than attachment. So again, this is an important factor to understand, that this plays a role not all the time, but can very much be there, particularly with the afflictions that we are habituated towards, that we have arising much more frequently. Number 5, the influence of misleading friends or social distraction. This is an important one because obviously we are under the influence of the people that we hang out with, the people that we spend time with. And we often, unless we have strength of mind and an ability to stay true to our what we are studying and trying to practice, we often fall under their sway. And we'll end up doing things and acting in ways and even thinking in ways that are not so healthy for our minds. I mean, look at what even happens in terms of political situations, such as the recent election and how you have that happening at a much larger level, right? Where people keep feeding into ways of looking at things and thinking about things and trying to incite more anger, frustration, what have you. And with regard to attachment, this is where people are encouraging you to pursue particular things. Maybe you have someone who you hang out with who you're always trying to find something pleasurable to go do and some new experience to have. Well, they're always drawing you down that pathway of attachment. Not that all instances of pleasure are attachment. We saw that in the text last time. That's one thing to make sure that we separate out. There's the experience of that pleasurable feeling, and then there's the attachment that arises when we grasp at it and don't want to let go of it, when we have exaggerated all of that. So once more, we have to be aware that these factors can cause us to move in that direction. If we do have friends that influence us, things in society, social distraction that kind of feeds into our way of looking at things. And if you think about it, I'm sure you can find in many cases of attachment that what's going on. Someone else is kind of helping you get to that place of being attached to that particular object, having that moment or experience of attachment or desire arising. The sixth one is kind of an interesting one. It's called traditionally following false teachings or explanations. But it gets at kind of the bigger way in which we are influenced by certain ways of thinking that are coming from maybe other traditions at times. Certainly, many of us have grown up in other spiritual traditions where we've gotten habituated to certain ways of looking at things. And then we have a harder time kind of breaking free of those because they have influenced the way that we go about living our lives. But also, we have a lot of things that just they penetrate into society and they influence the way that we think about stuff. Look at advertising. I mean, advertising is one of the biggest ways that our attachment is fed. I think I mentioned the example of an iPhone. I don't know what they're up to now. Is it like 16 or 17 or so they started off with one and then you go to two and three. And every time they introduce a new iPhone, there's like feeding this attachment machine, trying to get you to be attached to something new, something pleasurable, something wonderful. I don't think I mentioned this example last time, but I remember when the iPad was introduced. Of course, we take that object for granted now, right? Everybody's got one, it seems, and it's this very common object. When it was first introduced, nobody really even knew what it was, right? It was kind of like, what is this object? I remember they did a report on one of the local news stations down in Albuquerque, where they were outside the Apple store waiting for to open up at midnight or whatever for them to introduce the iPad. And all these people were standing in line and they went up to one of them and they said, "So you're here to buy the iPad?" And he says, "Yeah, I can't wait to get one." And he says, "Well, do you know what it's going to do or what it is?" He says, "No, but I want one." That was the mentality that was out in front of the Apple store waiting for this new object. So this sixth one is kind of like how all kinds of other stuff we get bombarded with, thinking that this is how to be a contributing member of society, is to buy into our consumer culture and to do all this and many other factors. I'm not just saying that's the only one, but that one's pretty pervasive, right? We have a culture that definitely feeds it. I mean, look at the holidays we were just through and all this, consumer spending and shopping and buying this and buying that and trying to. I mean, I'm not saying generosity is a bad thing. It's very nice to buy gifts for others and to do things, but we have to watch how our minds relate to these objects of attachment and how we get totally caught up in this distortion. So again, these six factors do play a role, not all of them all the time, but I think it's worthwhile to do some investigation on your own. And that's one of the mindfulness exercises I'm going to encourage you to do over the next week. I had already asked you to pay attention to that third one, which one again was the main one that we talk about in regard to attachment, our incorrect mental attention that is overlaying all kinds of pleasantness on objects that are really just inducing a pleasant feeling for us. They don't have that inherently there, and moreover, they don't have it to the degree that we think they do. And we think that it just covers the whole object, and there's nothing that is unfavorable about it or unattractive about it. Now, again, what is the answer to attachment? It is one of our virtuous mental factors. As I mentioned earlier when I touched on those going through that list, I'm not going to go through them in the order and go to every one of them necessarily, but I want to highlight a few of these because they're the opposite, the antidote to the affliction that we're talking about. In regard to attachment, we have this non-attachment. So let's go to our text first and read what Venerable Gyatso has in regard to non-attachment. And I'll have to find that in here. I think it's around page 93, maybe 94. There it is. Okay. So this is what he says about it. Non-attachment, again, this is a virtuous state of mind. It's the opposite of attachment. Although self-grasping ignorance, this is that third poison, again, the particular type of ignorance, is the root of all of our disturbing emotions. It is our attachment to transitory pleasures and objects of pleasure that binds us to the cycle of death and rebirth. Attachment wishes to acquire and keep close objects whose good qualities are exaggerated and whose bad qualities are ignored. This attitude easily leads us into non-virtuous actions, everywhere from killing all the way through engaging in idle gossip, just talking with others meaninglessly. As we approach death, attachment generates craving and grasping at life, which nurture karmic propensities for rebirth. And this is why some see desire or attachment as the root of cyclic existence. Though again, there's a deeper cause, that ignorance that was mentioned earlier. The opposite of attachment is non-attachment, sometimes again called detachment, which I'm not really as fond of. A strongly functioning positive attitude that, far from being a blank, emotionless state, renders the mind peaceful by seeing through the false projections of ignorance and attachment. So again, this is what we're trying to cultivate in regard to attachment, is to see through the delusion, how we are distorting our relationship to objects of attachment. Now, once more, I'm not trying to get you to divorce yourself from all pleasure. Becoming a good Buddhist doesn't mean that I never experience any pleasure ever again. In fact, Lama Yeshe used to tell Venerable Rabina, one of my teachers, used to tell her, the more pleasure, the better, dear. Pleasure is a wonderful thing. We have a distorted relationship to that pleasure. Pleasure, there's no problem with. It's our way of working with pleasure and being caught up by pleasure, grasping at pleasure, that becomes problematic. So we have to change our thinking about pleasure. You might, as I said, initially need to divorce yourself from those objects of pleasure. Put some distance between yourself and them to work with your mind. Look at what happens when people start dealing with their alcoholism or other substance abuse issues. The first and most important thing is to get those things out of your proximity, right? Don't hang out with all of your old drinking friends and using friends or whatever. Get yourself away from those objects, because otherwise you're going to be drawn back into them so easily. So we know that that's the beginning of it, but we have to have a healthier way of relating to the pleasures, the things that bring us pleasure, and the objects of pleasure. So let's talk a little bit about some of these and how we actually cultivate some more correct ways of thinking and looking at things. And there's more in Venerable Gyatso's section of that, around page 93 or 94. Let's talk about what non-attachment is, first from the perspective of His Holiness and Venerable Chodron. I've cited some passages from their book before where they go into some of these mental factors. And I'm trying to give you other words to talk about them. Venerable Gyatso's is maybe not as technical as this. Non-attachment is not the mere absence of attachment, but the opposite of attachment and the direct antidote to it. Referring to an object in psychic existence, meaning all the objects we have in our lives, non-attachment prevents and counteracts attachment and subdues obsession with attractive objects and people. It's the state of mind we need in order to not get so caught up in these objects, grasp at them, not want to be separated from them, even get angry and upset when that does happen. So the antidotes to attachment that are frequently discussed, and there are, I'm sure, many other ways that you could work with it, is first of all, to reflect on the faults of attachment. And this is often the case for all of these delusions. They are faulty states of mind. And the one thing I want to talk about before we go on with this, looking at the faults, is that we often think that our mind of attachment is actually a good mind to have. We don't see the faults of it, right? Because when we're caught up in that mind that is desiring something, we are causing our pleasure to rise and to have those feelings. I don't know what's going on physiologically. Physiologically, you probably have a lot of the what are the endorphins and all those, the serotonin, all those things that arise in your body when you are going after objects of pleasure. So we have this mistaken idea that there's nothing wrong with following our pleasure. And in the 60s, there was that phrase, if it feels good, do it. I mean, that's not a way to live our lives according to Buddhist principles, because a lot of things feel really good that we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be following those things blindly and putting all our confidence in those objects. Well, we have to begin to see that the mind of attachment is actually a very distorted and disturbing state of mind. When we're driven by attachment, the mind isn't at rest and isn't at peace. We are actually like a pinball machine, just waiting for this and that to happen and going all over the place trying to seek our objects of pleasure. So once more, we have to start to see the faults of that. And as I said, this is often an antidote that we introduce. And I think it's one that's well worth exploring. I'm trying to give you a number of tools to work with to overcome your patterns of attachment in your own life. So this is described as in the following way. The object, that object that brings us pleasure, never lasts, right? That's one of the disadvantages because we have to keep going back to it. Oh, yeah, I had a piece of cake yesterday, but I need another piece of cake today to keep that pleasure going. Or maybe we need 2 pieces in a day or 3 pieces in a day, whatever the case might be. But this is something that we see if we actually open our eyes. These things don't bring about an end of our craving. They actually become something we crave more and more and more. And that's the second part. It only feeds the dissatisfied mind. You never get to a place where you say, okay, I've had my final piece of cake and I'm totally satisfied now. Won't ever need to eat cake again. Also, the next one, the uncertainty of the object in fulfilling our immediate desire. And I often point out how when we are not in particularly good states of mind, maybe when we're grieving or when we're angry and upset, those objects of attachment don't quite do the trick sometimes. We see them and we just go, no, my mind's not there right now. And so other times we might go to them thinking that they're going to relieve what we're going through, and they don't fulfill that. They're not quite as reliable as what we'd like them to be. Our objects of attachment are extremely uncertain. Don't always have that quality. And I'm not just talking about how, like, if you have a favorite dish at a restaurant, how sometimes you go there and it's not prepared the way you like. I'm talking about just how the circumstances might be very different. Maybe you're having a meal with somebody who you don't really enjoy being with, and so you're sitting there and just not really enjoying the food quite as much. They don't have that ability to always fulfill our immediate desire. The next one, how other negative minds arise from it, such as jealousy, possessiveness, anger, insecurity, disappointment, etc. I mean, one of the things I'm going to emphasize when we get to the next root poison, that next affliction of anger, is that is the mind that happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. If we have this mind of attachment that's constantly craving and wanting things to go our way, for us to get to the store and to have the food that we want, that we are craving at that moment, that we really can't be without, and then it's not there, well, then we get angry and upset. We maybe even go to the people who stock the shelves and say, where's that? I was really looking forward to eating that. You don't have it on the shelf. What's wrong with you? And we can do all these kinds of exaggerated things on the basis of when attachment is thwarted in getting what it wants. So once more, this is indicative of the various afflictions that can arise. When we are attached to various things, we can become jealous of other people having them. We can have, all kinds of states of mind arise. Pride is a form of attachment to our own qualities and possessions and what have you. The next one, it exaggerates the importance of the object. And look at what happens when we overlay on top of stuff. I mean, I went through this when my mother passed away last year, going through all of her belongings in her house, and you kind of see the things that she considered important, right? And some of them, maybe, I could see, I took some objects. I didn't, leave there empty-handed. But I took things that I thought were maybe somewhat important for me. But even those objects, when I go, will probably be seen as not so important by whoever cleans up my stuff, right? So the reality is that we place a lot of importance on objects of attachment. Go to somebody's house and you accidentally knock a cup off the table that was the cup that their grandmother gave them or something. And then you see like, oh, they get so upset and they might even cry on the basis of this object being taken away from them. It's just an object. I mean, and it doesn't have the ability to provide that satisfaction to everyone. That's an overlay once more that you're putting on that object, grandma's teacup or whatever the case might be. And this begins when you start working with attachment, you begin to question how we are looking at various objects. And are we seeing the faults of the mind that is clinging at them with those thoughts in mind? Um, it keeps us in samsara. This is as was said by Venerable Gyatso. This is one of the main driving forces. We even have an attachment that arises at the end of our lives of craving and grasping to be embodied again, they say. Again, I won't go into that in great detail. But this is one of the major factors, as the Buddha said in his first teaching, that is the source or the root problem, one of the root problems of why we are in cyclic existence, samsara. And then the last one, it distracts us from achieving realizations on the path. In fact, it's said that in order to develop one of the most fundamental realizations, the mind of renunciation is a mind where we see samsara for what it is. And we want to emerge from it. We want to be free of it. We see it for the prison that it is. We don't want to continue to be in it from lifetime to lifetime. In order for you to realize that, you have to diminish your attachment. If you're continuing to be attached to your prison cell, I think it's what's her name? I can't think of her name right now. It's kind of a famous nun in the Kagyu tradition, um, Tenzin Palmo, Venerable Tenzin Palmo. She says that most of us in samsara, we're in our prison cell, and we just keep painting the prison cell a different color, thinking it's going to be a more pleasant place to stay in. Right? I think I'll try the shade of green now. And so we have this wonderful, beautifully painted prison cell, but we're in prison. This is what most of us are doing, right? Is we keep getting attached to our prison cell, keep having an attachment that is clinging to these faulty experiences, these unsatisfactory experiences, and never wanting to be parted from those. We don't, we're going to have to drag us out of our prison cell, kicking and screaming. So this is what's keeping us from developing realizations on the path, from moving on the path, is because we're still quite attached to samsara. And by the way, don't think because I'm talking this way that I'm free of all this attachment. I deal with my own attachments, and those can become major obstacles on our path. Our attachment to comfort. I mean, the Buddhist path is a strenuous one. I mean, we do have to do a lot of work, a lot of sitting, a lot of practices. You have to be very dedicated to this path to have some results that you can really notice and begin to make some progress. So again, to what degree do we have that underlying problem of attachment? So that's the very first one. Examine the faults. And as I've given you in this list, quite a few different faults that you could even be more specific on. When an object of attachment is coming into your field of experience and you see that mind arising, that distorted way of looking at it, think about one of these. How this is a block to you being able to continue your spiritual development, how it's only going to feed your dissatisfied mind. By the way, I'll use that phrase that Venerable Rabina used, that it's like we're junkies born into a world of junk. That is what the mind of attachment is showing us, essentially, is we are continually going after all this stuff that we have in our lives. And again, it only feeds the dissatisfied mind. What happens when a junkie gets more junk? It doesn't satisfy their craving. For the moment it does, but then as that wears off, then they need another fix. They need something else, right? So once more, this is a wonderful analogy for what we're dealing with, and we begin to see that we're actually junkies in this world, attached to all these various things, and perhaps we start looking at them differently. A second thing to think about in regard to attachment is to recollect impermanence and death. Recall that you will definitely have to be separated from the object sooner or later, whether it goes out of your life or you are forced to leave it behind at death. We can't take a single penny with us out of this life. One of the main meditations we do in Tibetan Buddhism, the very beginning of our stages of the path, we talk about how at death, the most important thing is what we have done with our minds, the degree to which we have tamed these afflictions, lessened our attachment, lessened our anger, our ignorance, and so on. So again, if we continue to be blind to that reality and we just live our lives with this delusion that we're just going to be here forever, that life is going to keep going on and we're never going to have to part from these objects, well, again, some of them may go out of your life in this, in this life and the years of this life, such as losing grandma's teacup when it falls and breaks or whatever. But at death, you're going to have to separate from everything. We really should be thinking about that every day of our lives. Are we ready to part from all these objects of attachment? That's why we need to work on attachment day in and day out, trying to lessen it so that when that moment comes, and we don't know when it's going to come, and our death is actually there, will we have a mind craving and grasping for something pleasant and not being able to work with at least keeping our mind somewhat still and undisturbed at that time? If we can have more positive thoughts at that time, that would be ideal, but at least not to have the mind going in all these crazy directions. So again, this is also something we need to keep in mind. Now, there's also the impermanence of those experiences, which we already did kind of allude to, that they don't really last. As I said, if you can have one piece of cake and have that satisfy you forever, well, then that would be great, right? You could say, "Oh, I have the pleasure of eating cake when I was 5 years old, and it's still satisfying me. It's a lasting, permanent solution to my problems." You know, no, it isn't. You have the cake, it changes over time. You need another piece of cake, another piece of cake, another piece of cake. So once more, impermanence and death, you can see it in terms of the impermanence of everything that is an object of attachment, but also that deeper, grosser form of impermanence that we are going to have to separate from all these objects eventually anyway. Yeah. That's why Master Shantideva, in his text, he says, if we have to separate with these at death anyway, maybe it's better that we use them well in this life and be generous with them, give them to others, share them with others, instead of hoarding them and holding on to them ourselves. That's one of the secondary forms, or close forms of attachment, is the miserliness that we have around these objects. Oops. Oh, I skipped one. Somehow I skipped one. I skipped number 2. I knew there were 3 that I put here on the list. Examine the undesirable aspects of the object. This is perhaps the more traditional way that you're encouraged to work with attachment. Because what's happening, let me take it off screen before I go through that in more detail. Remember that with what's happening with the mind of attachment is that you are exaggerating the attractiveness of that object. Let's go back to people, right? If you are falling in love with somebody or in love with somebody, and you have this idealistic way of looking at them and who they are and what have you, you are overlaying qualities and things on top of them that are probably not there. I mean, there might be some core things that you're basing that on. Oh, they kind of talk nice to me. Well, then, they're this person who always talks nice, who's never going to be mean or angry towards me, right? That's how we tend to exaggerate that. We make that into the sum total of that person, when in reality, they have many other aspects or features to them, some of which are unattractive. If we think about those unattractive aspects, it balances out what we're doing in terms of exaggerating the attractive ones. It brings us back down to some level of reality by saying, hey, let's look at the big picture. Let's look at the whole picture and actually acknowledge that any object of attachment has undesirable or unattractive aspects to it. Not that we then fall into an aversion like we normally do when we start seeing the warts and the bad breath and whatever of the person that we fell in love with, and then we go like, oh, they're garbage, I don't want anything to do with them. It's to have an ability to hold that holistic view and to say, I'm not going to be totally attached, I'm not going to be totally averse, I'm going to be just fine with that person being whoever they are, having unattractive and attractive aspects. And they might have a heavier weight to the attractive ones if we're going to stay with them and make a lasting relationship. Nothing wrong there. That's your karma with that person. But don't throw them out just because of the few unattractive things that you see that are a part of the picture as well. So a meditation in regard to this would be to look at those unattractive aspects so that we balance out our view. As it says here, for example, if a human body is the object of attachment, we can discern its unclean aspects, the things that, again, are there for everybody, body odor and what have you. I mean, we all can contend with this reality of having human bodies. So don't be so surprised when that person has a little bit of body odor, right? Or that there's something going on with them that isn't so attractive, or if the attachment is towards food, you can think about how unattractive that food is even after it has been chewed in the mouth for a short time, much less how repulsive it is as it goes through the alimentary canal and eventually exits the body. I mean, I'm not saying, again, you get this total aversion to food where you never eat it, but look at what we are doing with food. We make food into such a wonderful thing. We even have the Food Network where they have like cooking shows all the time, right? And they go to restaurants all around the world and show how beautiful and delightful and delicious food can look and taste. Of course, you can't taste it on the Food Network because you have to make it yourself or go to that restaurant. But the idea is that we put so much on food and how delicious and wonderful and beautiful it has to be when it's presented to us. But it all just goes into our mouth and goes down and gets digested and becomes feces. I mean, that's what goes on with food, right? And urine for that matter. But the idea is that Geshe Sherab emphasized this once, and he said, if you even took a piece of food, like say somebody brought in some chocolates and you had this chocolate and you put it in your mouth and you just had it in your mouth for a second and then you took it out and you put it back, nobody would want to eat it, right? Just the fact that it's been in our bodies, it's already kind of become impure, right? But we have this distortion that sees it when it's on the table untouched as being pure, and when it goes into our mouth, then we can accept that it's impure. Or when it's down coming out the other end, then it's impure. But we have to see that that's the whole nature of food. Food is the same continuum of that stuff that looks delicious and delightful on the plate, but then goes into our throats and esophagus and stomach and becomes something very different as it progresses downward. So we have to, again, see things for what they are. This is an interesting one because, again, this is one of the best antidotes to attachment, is to balance out our view. And I think that it can be really useful in terms of lengthening our relationships with other people. Why do we expect that somebody who initially showed particular positive qualities to us, that is who they are all the time, and that is the sum total of their being, and they're never going to be anything otherwise? We have to see that there are those unattractive aspects to their body, to their personality, to whatever. And every one of us has faults and flaws and things that need to be accepted for the fact that they're there, and not overlay this ridiculous mind that thinks that everything is beautiful and wonderful and pleasant. And it's a source of so much pain and suffering in our world, right? Especially when people do become attached to other people, and then those other people aren't attached to them any longer, and you can have even violence that ensues from that, right? So once more, this is a very healthy way to work with attachment. All of these are effective, though. Again, to see the impermanence and death and how we're going to have to be separated from that object, to see how faulty attachment is, how it really just guides us down pathways of creating more misery for ourselves rather than really solving our problem. While I'm on the subject of attachment, I do want to point out that in that one section where we talk about these 20 close afflictions, they are derived from the 3 root poisons, some of them in combination, some of them solely a single one. And that's, in this case, the 3 close afflictions that are derived from attachment. I want to talk about them because this is how attachment also arises for us. I already touched on briefly the first one, miserliness or avarice, this greedy mind that is tight-fisted and not wanting to let go of things. And then there's haughtiness or self-satisfaction, puffing up of our feeling of self and who we are. And then there's the excitement that arises when we're even thinking about objects of attachment, and that can be a big obstacle to our concentration. Let me share a little bit from Geshe Rabten. This is just a way to get our heads around this. There's also some descriptions in our text that we're using that you're welcome to take a look at. I put the pages on that in the assignment that I have in the final slide for tonight. Avarice or miserliness is a mental factor that, out of attachment to respect and material gain, firmly holds on to one's possessions with no wish to give them away. It has the function of cherishing one's possessions without letting them decrease, right? We don't want to let go of it. We just hoard. And there was that really disturbing show, Hoarders, that was on TV, where they showed people who are so attached to things that they even become attached to what people quite usually would call garbage, right? Decaying squashes in their house or something like that. It's kind of an interesting exaggeration of attachment that happens in those cases. This mental factor causes us pain whenever the possibility arises of being separated from what we own and regard as dear to us. In addition to occurring with regard to material objects, it can also develop with regard to our inner understanding of Dharma. Some people become very tight-fisted around their own Dharma knowledge. some other student will ask them, well, what do you know about the Four Noble Truths or something? And they say, well, not really too much, and they're not willing to share that knowledge that they've gained from their teachers with other people. We need to be very generous with what we have. In fact, generosity is the antidote to miserliness. And we can be generous with our material things if that's what we're feeling tight-fisted around. We can be generous with our time and our ability to support others and help them if that's what we're, tight-fisted on. If we're miserly around our Dharma knowledge, well, then we need to share our knowledge with others. Okay. There's even another form of generosity, the generosity of love, where we just, doesn't cost anything, just have thoughts of loving kindness and appreciation for other beings. It is thus the greatest obstacle to giving away our possessions to and sharing our understanding with others. In the future, it is a cause for both material and spiritual poverty. In fact, that is the main cause. If you don't have a lot of things in your life, if you've had a very hard life in terms of resources and what have you, it's just an indication that there's a karma you've created of not having been generous with resources in the past. And that's ripening into not having them in this life because you didn't share them with others. If you want to be assured of having good resources in the future, then you need to engage in the mind of generosity and the acts that come from that. And by the way, once more, because this whole course is all about our minds, getting to know our minds, the antidote and the part of our non-attachment is the mind that is intending to give. Whether we actually give or not isn't as important as our intention. Now, if our intention only manifests in our mind and we never give anything physically or never support other people with our time and what have you, then I think there's something kind of missing in the formula. But it begins with our intention to give. Yeah. There was a nun who was working up in the office when the FPMT had its office up in Taos, just north of here. And there was somebody I knew in the office who would give money to this nun thinking to help her. But she was working with our prison project. And so as soon as she'd get the money, she'd buy books for the prisoners. A really wonderful practice of generosity, like where anything comes in your door, you think that your whole purpose is to find a way to give that to other people, channel it somewhere else. There's a lot to be said about that in terms of the way that generosity becomes this amazing force in our world. Like in the Book of Joy, Archbishop Desmond Tutu talks about how the Dead Sea is the perfect example of the stagnancy of not being generous, because it is a pool of water into which everything flows, but it has no outflow. There's nothing that comes out of the Dead Sea. Therefore, everything becomes stagnant and putrid because there's nothing flowing. So once more, practicing generosity and just thoughts of generosity is a form of non-attachment that can overcome our miserliness. Let's go back to those secondary or close afflictions that are related to attachment. Self-satisfaction or haughtiness, Geshe Rabten describes as a mental factor that, being attentive to the marks of good fortune one possesses, brings the mind under its influence and produces a false sense of confidence. We get kind of full of ourselves. It's kind of can lead to feelings of pride, but it's that initial feeling of just attached to who we think we are. It has the function of giving rise to and being in accordance with all the other afflictions, as well as interfering with the attainment of any higher qualities, because we start thinking so well of ourselves that we think, well, why do I need to even follow these teachings or do this particular meditation or change my life or whatever, because I've actually got it going on pretty well. Self-satisfaction produces a false sense of haughtiness through considering the superiority of our race, physical appearance, learning, youth, or authority over others, and many other factors. I mean, we can be haughty about a variety of things that you possess, that you think, again, have elevated you to some superior status. However, he says, it is not necessarily unwholesome to be aware of the good qualities that you may have. What must be avoided is to overvalue them and conceitedly boast about them. This mental factor of haughtiness or self-satisfaction is very liable to give rise to self-importance. That was his term for pride. We're going to talk about pride a little later because it is one of the 6 root afflictions. But we see that there is an element of attachment that comes into play with pride, right? We become very attached to this view of ourselves, and the haughtiness that precedes it, this feeling of being quite self-satisfied with who I am, what I have, my life as it is, that becomes a big obstacle for us on our spiritual path. And it can lead to a heightened sense of pride, and pride becomes a huge obstacle to progressing on the path, to developing our minds and so on. So once more, this is also something we can see very much rooted in attachment, rooted in a grasping at things in an exaggerated, distorted way. The last one comes into play a lot around our meditation. This is where it's usually talked about. Excitement. Excitement is a mental factor that, through the force of attachment, does not allow the mind to rest solely upon a wholesome object, but scatters it here and there to many other objects. It has the principal function of obstructing our quieting the mind, our mental quiescence, or what is often called calm abiding, its ability for the mind to become very focused and concentrated. Also, it causes the mind to engage in uncontrolled fantasy and frivolity. This mental factor is often with us, but its presence only becomes truly felt when we start to concentrate the mind in meditation. Not all forms of mental distraction are caused by excitement, only those that are brought about by our attachment to or desire for an agreeable, contaminated object. So this is the role that excitement plays in terms of our being an obstacle in our meditation. But it is there throughout our day, and we don't notice it so much. Once more, it goes back to what I said earlier tonight, that when we're following the mind of desire, we actually get quite a hit out of that, right? And all the serotonin and all that stuff happens in our body. But that's the excitement of thinking about, oh, I can't wait to get that, and I can't wait to do this, and da 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 da. It's the anticipation that we feed into all of that. Those are all part of the mind of excitement. But where it becomes really noticeable is when we sit down to meditate, we're trying to focus the mind, but all we can do is think about, oh, yeah, that arrives tomorrow and I can't wait to have it and plug it in and see what it's like and blah, 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 blah. All the things that we get excited about. The mind then again becomes like a pinball machine when we're trying to make it very stable and focused. Making the mind stable and focused is an important part of our spiritual progress in Tibetan Buddhism, because without that, how can we possibly deepen these qualities in our minds? We're going to be continually, like they often use the example of how, like, if you're um, trying to chop down a tree, and you've got this axe that's going to the tree, and if every time that you hit the tree, you're hitting it in a different place, you're never going to get the tree cut down, right? When you have distraction in the mind where you're always going somewhere else, you're not keeping the mind single-pointedly focused, having that perfect aim of the axe, well, then you're never going to make any progress. So once more, excitement is also a derivative of attachment. It's what happens in sometimes quite subtle ways. They say that sometimes in our meditation, we might get rid of the coarser excitement where we're not being drawn to these objects quite as much, but we still have a very subtle attachment that they say is kind of like water running underneath ice in the winter, right? The ice is on the top and it looks very stable, but there's always this underflow of attachment and excitement, very subtle. So once more, I'm just pointing out different features of this so that we touch on a number of these mental factors as well. But when attachment has different flavors to it, as miserliness, self-satisfaction or haughtiness, as excitement, because these are also ways that we can be more kind of clearer in our minds as to what is actually going on. So I'm going to skip over, I threw these in here just in case I finished a little bit earlier, but what I want to do is go into the exercises I'm going to encourage you to do and then open it up for some questions, because I think if we start throwing anger into the mix, we're going to kind of, we'll might get angry. I might get you all angry at me. Mindfulness exercise number one. Now I realize it's only a week. Last time we had like 3 weeks between the two classes, the last one and this one. So I gave you a few more exercises, but do what feels comfortable to you. Even to do these once or twice, I think would be wonderful. As you come into contact with objects that produce a pleasurable feeling, notice how the mistaken conception of attachment arises, particularly with regard to now all 6 factors. For the holidays, I had you work with just mainly that distorted way of thinking, that inappropriate mental attention or conceptualization. But in regard to all 6, remember the object, the inappropriate thinking, the seed of the delusion. Of course, that's not as noticeable. That's just always there. And then the three that have to do with the habituation to that, the misleading friends and other social distractions, and then, of course, any other things we bring in through our environment, false teachings or distortions that we get from advertising and things, as I mentioned, in regard to attachment in particular. And also notice whether just having that awareness of the process of attachment arising can disrupt its development. Sometimes once we kind of turn away from the object of attachment and see kind of what's going on in my mind, there's already a lessening of the attachment because you're sort of shining a spotlight on what attachment is doing. I think that's one of the useful things that we were talking about, the three antidotes, and we'll get to them in a moment because I want you to work with them if you have attachment arising as well. But sometimes even looking at what's going on causes you to pull away from that attachment. I don't know if you've had that experience. Hopefully you have, where it's kind of like, oh, I'm not going to feed my attachment because I see what is involved in the process and see how unhealthy my conceptions are and so on. So having meditated, it is important to meditate on these antidotes to attachment, reflect on the faults of attachment, those that I put on that slide, examining the unattractive features of the object, recollecting impermanence and death. All three of these, if you've meditated on them, then they'll be more likely to arise when you encounter an object of attachment. But as it says here, as you come into contact with those objects that produce a pleasurable feeling, and you see desire or attachment arising, apply any of those three to see how they curtail the progression of attachment. And it's worthwhile working with these. If one of these you look at and you go, oh, no, I don't really want to work with the unattractive features of the object, I'm just not there yet, that's okay. Think about the faults of attachment, or think about impermanence and death, or maybe that's the one that you find difficult because you don't want to think about your own death. Well, then again, there's many different antidotes that we can work with. Number 3, take note of the close afflictions that are derived from attachment, miserliness, haughtiness, and excitement, and apply the antidotes to attachment to them as well. They're going to work with the same antidotes because those are all minds of attachment that are arising. With miserliness, it might be particularly the fact that you're going to die. All those objects that you're holding on so tight to, you aren't going to be able to take them with you. Might as well, again, not be so attached to them. Maybe even be generous with them. Again, the other ones you can apply the same sort of thinking to as well. So once more, there are some pages that I'm going to encourage you to take a look at in regard to this topic of attachment that I think would be worthwhile. In the main book that we're using, the one that I cited some passages from earlier tonight, in that part 4, how the disturbing emotions arise, and we're looking at these 51 mental factors. Within that, there's the 6 root afflictions. I already had you read the bit on attachment. If you missed out on that, you can just read the pages that immediately precede anger, because we're going to go into anger next week. I would like you to read ahead if you have the time. It's only, about 5-6 pages. It's not really too much. And it might be good to have some exposure to that before we meet next week. The 20 close afflictions, there are 5 close afflictions derived from anger that I will be touching on in next week's class, hopefully. And then 3 close afflictions derived from attachment that we looked at this week that I didn't have in the reading last time. And there's some pages for all of those, 115 through 119. And then in the reference materials, this mind and mental factors, some teachings from Lama Yeshe. There are about 7 pages, 8 pages that cover anger that you might want to read. There are the pages that preceded it that dealt with attachment. So I'm just encouraging you, those of you who have more time, if you don't have time for all this, don't worry about it. Great, still just to show up, be here on Wednesday, hear what I have to say, and and work with it as best as you can. But I think it does help to reinforce some of our learning in the class, to read a little bit, to hear other perspectives on some of these things. And then, of course, if you can read ahead, that's great. If not, you can always read these things after I've covered them. So any comments or questions on attachment and what we talked about tonight? If you're here in the Gompa and you want to share something, just put your hand up and we'll bring the microphone to you so you can have that amplified for the folks here as well as for at home. We do have one on the chat box. Let me go to there and then you can go ahead and go over for next. Deb asked, could you talk about how to fall in love and get married without attachment? How to maintain loving relationships with a partner with balance. Well, that's a big subject, but I appreciate you bringing it up because, as I was saying earlier tonight, I think it's a really important part of it. You know, when we come to accept other people for kind of warts and all, you know, that we embrace them. And even some of our marriage vows are like that, right? Where we say in sickness and in health and in poverty and in wealth or whatever, you know, all those different things that we talk about. I think that it is good that we try to maintain those kinds of balanced perspectives. That we don't expect that the person that we wake up to next to, you know, wake up next to, or whatever the case might be, that they're going to be the same person day in and day out. They have their own minds and their own karma and their own stuff that's going on for them, and they're going to be dealing with their own problems and difficulties often too. So I think that there's a good part of it that is involved in that. What I would encourage you to do, I have done a class on this subject before of like working with relationships, um, conscious relationship, I think I called the class. There's a wonderful book. I never know how exactly to pronounce his last name, David Richo or Rico, Richo. And he wrote a book called um, How to Be an Adult in Relationships. And there's some wonderful advice in there. He finds these 5 A's, and I can't remember them all at this moment. Acceptance. I'm not going to, I just didn't prepare and have this in my kind of immediate thoughts to be able to bring it to mind. But he has these 5 A's. And when I first started, I was like, oh, yeah, you found 5 things that start with A that are all really important. You know, it seemed a little bit gimmicky, but they actually are all really good in terms of being able to work with getting our heads around how to be in relationship with somebody as an adult rather than going back to patterns that are not so beneficial. So that's all I'm going to say about that tonight. I would really, yeah, defer to that. And maybe there are recordings of that course that I did somewhere out there on the internet. I don't know. It'd be, I haven't done that course in a while. Maybe I should do it again. But Patrick, yes, thank you for that question, Deb. Oh, it's not on, maybe. Okay. 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 Patrick was just saying, I'm not sure if you heard it online or not, but he was just saying that it was a similar question to what Deb had of, you know, and again, I wish, I mean, there's a lot to be said for, you know, how to do that, but there are a lot of different tools. And I think that's where David Richo goes into this in his book so much more in terms of the different ways that we do engage in a relationship with more conscientiousness, with more consciousness, with more awareness. Um, Anyone else online or here in the Gompa have a question or comment about attachment? Ah, yes, Tosan. Microphone over there.
It's a request. Can you put the slide that shows the 6 factors up?
I also am going to be putting those in the box too, though the drive. But let me go ahead and put that up there. There was a request to have the 6 factors on the screen. Can you? Uh-huh. And they'll be coming up. We'll be working with them again next week when we deal with anger. We have a question or a hand up from Scarlett in the Zoom room. Great.
Hello. Um,
Hi.
hi. I'm wondering if you can sort of give us an example. Like, I'm sort of a learner that I learn through an example, right? So, say for example, there is a restaurant that I want to go and eat at. So, right there, there's that desire. So, are you trying to say that I still go and eat at the restaurant, but I am not clinging or having all these desires about the food, which I'm a foodie, so I love it. So I just want to understand how I'm supposed to be approaching what you're talking about in real life. Thank you.
That's a that's a great question, Scarlett, and a great example. Because again, I don't want to say that we avoid all pleasurable experiences because there's nothing wrong with going to your favorite restaurant or a new restaurant. But you can see, like with a new restaurant in particular, you already once more might have some conceptualizations based on the fact that you heard about this restaurant, maybe in the newspaper, they had a review of it, or a friend went to it and they said, oh, the food was incredible, it was so wonderful. You might already be building up an expectation around that food that is an unhealthy mental construct, right? Because once you walk in the door, you're already putting the bar way up here for that restaurant, regardless of what it is that they're going to serve you or whatever's going on that night or whatever sort of day the chef had or whatever might be other factors in terms of what might influence your actual experience of that. So we can see that sometimes our distorted conceptualizations already start to play a role even before we've experienced the object, because we're thinking about the object in the future as something that we're going to experience. Expectations are a part of this. I haven't used that word tonight, but definitely they come into play. I remember there's that wonderful phrase, expectations are premeditated resentments. So it's a wonderful way to look at it. When we have this expectation, we are premeditating our resentment that may arise on the basis of having put the bar way up here, having this expectation that might be quite unrealistic. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any expectations of anything. I think there might be realistic expectations versus unrealistic. But anyway, let's get back to the restaurant. So then you walk in the restaurant and you sit down to eat, and you're already maybe taking in, well, this experience, what's going on, the service, the people who are serving you, what have you. All of that, you're kind of forming an opinion about it, and then the food actually comes, and you're starting to partake of the food and have hopefully a pleasant experience with pleasant sensations. If we really pay attention, you can be in the experience of that pleasant food without the mind of attachment arising. And in fact, they say that it's probably even more pleasant. I remember one of the first meditation classes I went to, I can't remember the man's name, it was at a place in San Francisco on Dolores Street. And they do this exercise sometimes in the Vipassana tradition of having you eat a raisin mindfully. Have any of you done this? You just try to be completely present with the sensation and taste of a raisin as you are chewing that raisin in your mouth, rather than going into these conceptual spin-offs on it, right? It is possible to have an experience of the pleasurable taste of that food, or even the unpleasurable taste of that food, without the mind spinning off in these directions. If we've trained our minds to lessen our attachment, to see these transitory experiences of these sensory objects in that light, as not having kind of placing all that onus on them and making them into something that once more is even more delicious and delightful than what it is, well, then you can enjoy the pleasure of that object. And you can enjoy it without the mind going out of control. Now, how the mind of attachment arises is that and I see this in myself sometimes, right? I have to be more mindful often in my own eating, is that if I'm sitting down, like, they bring a nice dessert after you've had this incredible meal already, and you're like going, you just see it, and immediately your eyes already get bigger, right? Oh, this looks so delicious, so yummy. The presentation is so wonderful. And then you start putting the forkful in your mouth, the very first forkful you put in. And while you're chewing it, you're already thinking about the second forkful. And maybe you just keep going like this, where you're not even really appreciating the taste of the food at all. I mean, you are getting some of the pleasure out of it. I'm not denying that, or else you wouldn't keep eating it. But you're not really enjoying the experience. You're not really capable of bringing in the pleasure unadulterated, just for what it is. And if you have the good karma to have that delicious meal, to have that delicious dessert, there's nothing wrong with enjoying that pleasure. Just have to watch once more how the mind overlays this incredible story around it. And then, you even start talking to other people about how wonderful it was and how this is so delicious. I can't wait to taste that again, and da 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 da. You feed your dissatisfied mind looking for that next hit. It becomes that junkie mentality. So that's what I'm trying. In that example, I hope I've given you enough to work with. It's not to say don't go to these places or don't, have these experiences. Just watch what's going on with your mind when you're having them. And to what degree are you getting caught up in all of it without even experiencing the real pleasure that is there? I see this happen to me. I mean, even I think I can admit this. Venerable Rabina, when I had lunch with her over the summer, she told me, she says, we can do all this meditation and thinking about non-attachment, and then somebody plops a dessert right in front of us and it all goes out the window and we just start shoveling it in our mouth, right? I was just kind of there nodding my head, right? Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Because this is how we tend to relate to those objects. We just get totally engrossed in them. We put all the onus on them and we don't see what's going on there as this interactive, interconnected thing. You know. So have an acknowledgement of the good karma that you have to have these experiences of delicious food in your life, but don't make that the be all and end all of what brings you happiness and pleasure, because those things, once more, are not certain and reliable. Mhm. I mean, look at when we're sick. When you're kind of sick, and maybe your taste buds aren't quite all there, and certainly if you had COVID and your smell isn't there or something, if you had that side effect, we know that the food that we normally eat is just not as pleasurable, right? You go, it's just not doing it for me tonight, right? So we know that those things are not reliable sources of our happiness. And Buddhism, once more, is trying to help us to go inside and find those sources of happiness. We've had attachment and desire with us for so long that we think, as I said many times tonight, that it's a pleasurable mind, that it's a good mind to have. But we don't know what it's like to have a mind at peace during those experiences, to be able to bring in those pleasurable sensations, or as I said, even unpleasurable sensations, and not go out of whack. Not be like a yo-yo. I mentioned this previously in this class, that goes way up here and then goes plummeting way down when something negative happens, and then we go plummeting way back up, or rising way back up and then falling way back down. This is how our minds are usually. So if we begin to pay attention, we see that that's what's going on, and that's not really a desirable place to be. And it's not pure stoicism. One student asked me once, aren't we just talking about then being like stoic? And I'm like going, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's something more to it, because we're inducing a level of peace eventually as we practice working with our minds, getting to know our minds, that is really pretty unparalleled. Where we can actually get to a place where we can be pretty blissed out. I mean, look at our lamas. Look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Yeshe, all these beings who were just happy all the time, and they didn't need delicious food and comfortable surroundings and whatever the case might be. They were quite happy regardless of the situation. That's what we're aiming for, is a mind that can be in that place of not just kind of a flatline sort of thing, but really quite content and satisfied in a deeper way, rather than always putting the onus on outside things to satisfy us. So anyway, that was a bit more perhaps than what I needed to say, but were there any other questions in the chat box? I didn't check. Thank you, Shayla, for putting that reference to that book. Again, that book is How to Be an Adult in Relationships. Let's do our prayers. And if you do have any further questions, please jot them down. There'll be an opportunity next week if you'd like to ask them then. All right, so we're going to do the first prayer where we're dedicating all this positive potential that we've created by turning our minds towards this subject for our own development into the state of Buddhahood, so we can then become a guru, a teacher for all others, to help them to achieve that same result. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And this wonderful mind that we meditated on at the beginning of tonight, called bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha for the benefit of all beings, to get to know our minds that deeply so that we then can help others to do that same work. We want that mind of bodhicitta to grow and develop and to not decline in the least. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then we make prayers for the good health, long life, the fulfillment of all the holy wishes of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. As we recite that verse, think that we're also creating the causes for all of our gurus, all those people who are very integral in our spiritual development, to have the same results. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And we've been doing regularly our prayer for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, who passed away in April of 2023, making strong prayers for his reincarnation to be here again, so we and others can benefit from his presence and guidance. Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta, the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Lastly, we dedicate for anyone that we're holding in our heart. All of us know beings, people, animals, pets, whoever, that are experiencing problems and difficulties right now, illness, who might even be dying or might have died recently. Whatever it is that they're experiencing, kind of send this positive energy out to those beings. Think that it becomes the cause to immediately remove all of their suffering and also to bring them everything that will help them to achieve ultimate peace and happiness. And may all beings be free of suffering and find true happiness through what we've done here tonight. All right, thank you all, and thank you for staying a little bit over. Apologize for that. So we'll continue next week looking at anger, and we'll carry on until the end of February. So, all right, everyone, have a good week working with attachment, and I will see you in a week. All right, bye-bye.